Well, my intention today is to discuss what I believe is one of the, other than sin, is one of the biggest impediments that can keep a person from coming to the faith, or for many of our young people today can lead to a loss of faith, and that is evolution, or the teachings of natural science. Jesus himself spoke to this. He says, I have spoken to you of earthly things and you do not believe. How then will you believe if I speak of heavenly things? The Bible is under attack today, and in particular, it's the historical components of the Bible that are being attacked by a scientific community that holds to an atheistic worldview, who is trying to explain how our world came to be through purely natural processes. If we can't, the Bible, the passage here that I would allude to, argues that if we cannot trust what the Bible says on historical matters like the global flood or Garden of Eden, these components of the Bible, how can we trust what it says about spiritual matters like salvation? The Old Testament and New Testament are inseparable. And if a person finds themselves doubting content in the Old Testament, how are they going to be able to trust content in the New Testament? And I believe that natural science today is, again, one of our biggest impediments that is keeping people from coming to the faith. And for young people that grow up in the church, can lead to a loss of faith. And I can tell you, many times I've been contacted by students who get up into college and find themselves in a faith crisis because of what they've been taught. We have to remember that the science that's being taught today is a science that's based on atheism. And I'm not claiming that all scientists are atheists, because this is clearly not the case. But the science that's being taught is a science that's exclusively based on atheism. They've rejected the Bible as a accurate historical document that describes the early periods of the earth. They've rejected the existence of God and His creation, and they're doing their best to explain how our world came to be through purely natural processes. They're dedicated to naturalism. This is the reigning philosophy of science today. That's why we call our science museums natural history museums. It describes the history of the world through within the bounds of naturalism. Or why a naturalist has been a synonym for a scientist going back a couple hundred years. Why we call the world outside nature. I don't even like using the word nature anymore, because that's the creation. But when this view, when this naturalism philosophy is applied to the living world, to the world that's outside, to the biological world, that's where the evolution comes from. We need to keep in mind that evolution is a theory that has been put forth to explain how life came to be on this planet through purely natural processes. And unfortunately, a lot of Christians just don't understand this, don't understand the significance that evolution can have on a person of faith, or keeping someone from coming to the faith. Many Christians accept evolution, the people that we would call theistic evolutionists. But in my opinion, there's two ways of reconciling the conflicts that exist between science and the Bible. There's two ways of reconciling the conflicts that exist. One is that you accept what scientists are teaching, and then look to the Bible to see how you can reinterpret it to be in agreement, or we assume what the Bible teaches is correct, and we look to see how the scientific findings can be interpreted to be in agreement with the Bible. And in my opinion, we should be doing the latter. And one of the most important scientific findings out there that needs to be interpreted within the Bible is the fossil record, because the fossil record stands as one of the main proofs of evolution today. And informed as we are by the global flood, we should assume that the geology of that event has been misinterpreted, which it most certainly has. Okay, so I want to focus on, one of my purposes is to help you understand what evolution is. I've studied evolution at the graduate level, and so I can describe for you well what evolution is, and I want to help you understand what we can accept and what I believe we can't accept, and then look to see what we've learned since Darwin formed his seminal theory to what we've learned since that pokes many holes in all of this business. Okay, so Darwin published his seminal book On the Origin of Species in 1859, which included two main principles: the principle of descent with modification, that newer organisms are versions of their ancestors, as well as a mechanism to explain how these new organisms come to be, a mechanism he termed natural selection. Natural selection ultimately occurs because within populations there is diversity. And the existence of diversity is one of the main proofs, if you will, of evolution, that organisms are evolving through time. Darwin himself was an accomplished breeder of pigeons. And much of his views about natural selection came from his own experience in pigeon breeding. He was an accomplished breeder of pigeon. Many people were during this time. Pigeon breeding was a very popular hobby From the very rich all the way down to the terribly poor, you could be a breeder of pigeons. Pigeons were wild. You could grab them off the streets anywhere and set up a little ramshackle coop up somewhere and start your own little pigeon population. And through selective breeding, you could come up with some really wild breeds if you controlled their mating. And from the rock pigeon, from the basic wild pigeon that was present in England, lots of diverse, weird-looking breeds were developed through what we call artificial selection. And again, Darwin was well familiar with these domestic breeding histories. He actually published a book in 1868 titled The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication, where he charted the breeding history, or what we call a genealogy, of domestic pigeon breeds. So he knew how this worked, that by controlling who would mate within a population, you could get that population to change through time. And he envisioned nature to be doing the same thing. That nature, he argued, also selects who can mate based on traits that they have that would make them more beneficial than others. Traits, for example, like size or the kind of hair that is possessed by an animal could dramatically affect their survival ability in a particular habitat, or predator-prey competitions, and therefore dramatically determine who will be more successful, who would live longer. And if you live longer and get more food, you're going to have more offspring, and the population can rapidly shift in one direction because of this process we call natural selection. And there's not a problem with this, not a problem at all with natural selection as being a valid mechanism that God put in place to help organisms adapt to the diverse types of habitats that we find on the earth today. Well, some of Darwin's main examples came from observations he made on a famous voyage he took out to the Galapagos Islands. And one of his primary examples were the finches that he saw in the Galapagos Islands. One of his main examples to support this theory he called natural selection. What he found on the Galapagos Islands were finches of a variety of types. On one island, he found there was a finch with a smaller beak, or another there was a larger beak, and another where there would be a hooked beak, because on the different islands they were eating different types of foods. And he argued that natural selection had been involved. That a wild type population from South America at some point found their way to the Galapagos Islands, perhaps when it was still part of the mainland. It's an island chain. Island chains were once land bridges until isolated. So he argued that a population of finches made their way out to the Galapagos, and then because of natural selection had changed into these different types of finches. Okay, but he uses this example to support that all organisms on Earth have descended from one common ancestor through this mechanism. The problem with this is that the finches are still finches. There's really no upward progression, upward level of change that's demonstrated here. All examples of evolution just show minor levels of variation. I mean, the change in a finch's beak from big to small is hardly enough evidence to support that all life on Earth has descended from a common ancestor. More than this, what they found was that the population would often revert back to a mean. The beaks would change during certain seasonal changes to different types of beaks. And when the weather returned back to what was more normal in that island, the beak would return back to a normal size. So they would oscillate back and forth. There was no upward progression that we saw here. Now, I want to talk to you about speciation. Although Darwin's book was called On the Origin of Species, he never actually discussed how species originate, but rather how a species will change through time through this mechanism called natural selection. Now, a species is defined as a naturally occurring breeding group that is reproductively isolated from other such groups. It is a breeding population that is related to, but is separated from another breeding population. And we can accept, I believe, that new species form through time. What typically happens to form a new species is that a parent population will become splintered, or during the process of, for example, migration, a population will become isolated from another part of its population. This often happens because they're separated by geographic barriers. Two populations will start migrating and will be separated by a body of water or by a large land mass like a mountain, and they will live for a period of time in isolation. One over here where it's wet, like on this side of the Cascades, another over on the other side where it's dry, and those populations will start to adapt and change through time as they start to specialize to those different habitats. Well, one of the things that we've discovered, one of the things that's been observed, is when these populations, for example, after a period of isolation, if they ever have a chance to reunite, what will happen is that the populations will remain separate. Even though living in the same areas, if those populations that lived apart for a period of time are ever reunited and living back in the same area, the separate populations will remain separate instinctively. They instinctively remain separate from one another. And this indicates that this process is part of design, because it's an innate process. It's an instinctive or innate process. They instinctively remain separate. And the reason for this seems obvious: to preserve the specializations that have been developed over a period of time. Now think about if the polar bear, for example, if a brown bear made it up into the polar bear region and bred with the polar bears that are up there, all the specializations that allow polar bears to be so successful where they live could be lost in one generation by hybridizing with the brown bear. Those specializations can easily be lost. So by remaining instinctively separate, they are preserved. And what can happen through time, these specializations can lead to enough genetic change where the chromosomes become unable to pair and cross over during the first division after fertilization. They can become genetically incompatible. But the fact that they remain separate in the wild instinctively indicates that the entire process is by design. And that's one of the mechanisms that God built into the various kinds He made. Okay? So we can accept this. We can accept that speciation happens, that natural selection is a significant part of helping organisms adapt to environments. I don't have a problem with these phylogenetic trees. Like the evolutionists use little diagrams like this to kind of illustrate how organisms have changed through time. From what was one parent population, you get different species, and then they'll start to change and you get more species. By the way, evolutionists are fond of calling these diagrams a tree of life. Right? What we have a problem with is the assertion that all life on Earth has descended from a common ancestor through this mechanism. This is one of the things we have a problem with. It's not that organisms change through time. It's not that they evolve, but that that this process that has been observed, this adaptational process and speciation, are responsible for all life on Earth. This is what we have a problem with. The small-scale change that we see happening in populations that we would call microevolution is being used to support a grand theory that all life on Earth is related to one common ancestral cell. One ancestral cell is believed to have developed all on its own through purely natural processes and has given rise to all life on Earth. This is what we have a problem with, that and the fact that they claim mutations as a source of genetic information. Ludicrous. I'll discuss that maybe a little bit later. The existence of information coming about through random changes is just one of the tremendous, unreasonable parts of the whole theory of evolution. Okay, but let me introduce you to someone. This is Ernst Haeckel. Ernst Haeckel was an evangelical promoter of Darwinism in Europe. In fact, Charles Darwin believed that Ernst Haeckel's enthusiastic propagation was the chief factor in his theory's success in Germany, and by extension, Europe. Ian Taylor, in his book In the Minds of Men, said that Haeckel became Darwin's chief European apostle, proclaiming the gospel of evolution with evangelic fervor, not only to the university intelligentsia, but to the common man by popular books, and to the working classes by lectures and rented halls. Ernst Haeckel was the first person to create a tree of life that included mankind. But to fill in the gaps between humans and apes, he just went ahead and invented an ape man. He believed that the only major difference between man and apes was that men could speak and apes could not. He therefore postulated a missing link that he named Pithecanthropus allalis, which means speechless ape man, and even had an artist, Gabriel Max, draw the imagined creature you see here, although there was not a scrap of physical evidence to support its existence. A contemporary of Ernst Haeckel's by the name of Rudolf Virchow, who was famous as the founder of cellular pathology and for many years was the president of the Berlin Anthropological Society, was scathing in his criticisms of Ernst Haeckel. For him to have given a zoological or scientific name to a creature that had not been proven to exist was to him a great mockery of science. and Haeckel would eventually become notorious as the scientist who perpetuated fraud after fraud to promote the theory of evolution. Charles Darwin sketched out a tree of life, and one of the big mysteries for Charles Darwin was the fact that he could not connect together life on Earth through a gradual blending or gradual series of transitional forms. When he looked around at living populations, he saw distinct groups that were separated from one another by massive gaps. In a little sketchbook, he refers to why these groups exist, and he attributes it to extinction. I could read this text for you. He says, I think case must be that one generation then would be would have as many living as now. To do this, to have as many species in the same genus requires extinction. Thus, between A and B, there's an immense gap of relation. Between C and B, there's a finer gradation. Between B and D, there's rather greater distinction. Thus, genera would be formed, bearing relation to ancient types with several extinct forms. He attributed these gaps between these various branches on the tree of life to extinction. Now, his theory told him if the kinds of selection was involved that breeders have been doing, that crate pigeons and horses and cows and dogs and cats, this would be a slow and gradual process over many successive generations. And what you should see is an imperceptible blend of organisms from one type to another. But what we see are distinct groups. And to Charles Darwin, this is very, very puzzling. And he assumed that through time, that fossils would eventually be found to prove this theory true. In living populations, there are distinct groups. He assumed that these distinct groups are due to extinctions. But he assumed that the fossils, all those animals lived at one point in time and became extinct, and we should find their ancestors in the fossil record. And he predicted that would happen. He actually gives a carefully worded apology in his book on the origin of species that he couldn't point to fossils at that point in time. But here we are 150 years later. The question is, have those transitionals be found? What Darwin didn't know is that the missing links were really missing. Now, what the fossil record looks like, you see here a diagram of the fossil record. And they use illustrations like this. What we've found is that in the layers of rocks that blanket the Earth, fossils are found, and that fossils are typically found below or above other fossils. Now, we attribute the fossil record to the global flood. And we believe that what you're looking at there is just the destruction of successive habitats. As the floodwater rose, it destroyed habitats sequentially because different plants and animals live in different areas. These different kinds of habitats we call biomes, and these biomes differ from one another based on the amount of rainfall and temperature in those areas. And the amount of rainfall and temperature is directly related to elevation. So as the floodwaters rose, it systematically destroyed successive habitats. That's why they're sorted the way they are. But to an evolutionist, this sorting of fossils represents the history of life on Earth over hundreds of millions of years. But all they can really point to is that there's different fossils in this layer than the one above. For evolution to be illustrated by the fossil record, they need to be able to show that an organism changed through time through a series of fossil forms. The question is, can they? This is what Darwin predicted. He predicted that the fossils would be found in the fossil record, that we only have this one now and this one now, but all the other was in between went extinct, and that they would be found in fossil forms. But he was very puzzled that he couldn't point to them in that day, predicted that they would be found. Now, I should point out that Darwin himself didn't invent evolution by any means. There were a lot of people during Darwin's day that believed in evolution. His theory differed in a couple of main areas. One was that the mechanism he proposed to explain these different forms was a very slow and gradual process. This process called natural selection would be very slow and gradual. Most of the evolution of Darwin's day held to a mechanism they called saltation. Saltation. They believed evolution would occurred in rapid jumps because of these groups. We have groups of organisms that are vastly separated from one another. You know, you got a whole bunch of turtles, and you got a whole bunch of lizards, and you got a whole bunch of snakes, and in any kind of animal that you want to talk about, you have distinct groups. And you look at the invertebrates, The invertebrate phyla are about as distinct from one another as animals can possibly be. You got the cnidarians or your echinoderms, like your starfish, right? Your mollusks, like your clams or your arthropods. You got just as distinct as you can possibly be. To evolutionists of Darwin's day, they believed that evolution occurred in rapid jumps because of these tremendous gaps. Darwin said, no, this is not true. Evolution must occur in slow and gradual processes. And that was one of the main things he took exception to with evolutionists of Darwin's day. The main difference between his theory and theirs was it must be slow and gradual. He predicted that fossils would eventually be found. But the gaps are real. The absence of these transitional forms are significant. There is nothing connecting these various invertebrate phyla together. They're as separate from one another as an animal can possibly be. There's not an imperceptible blend in living populations or in fossil forms. And there's nothing in the fossil record that shows where these animals came from. The first time a jellyfish appears in the fossil record, they're a perfectly formed jellyfish. The first time a starfish appears in the fossil record, they're perfectly formed starfish. The first time a bat appears, perfectly formed bat, or a pterosaur, like a pterodactyl, perfectly formed. Nothing in the fossil record that shows where they came from. And some paleontologists will admit this. Often people don't, this is Stephen Jay Gould, who arguably one of the most famous paleontologists of our day. I say this because he was featured on an episode of The Simpsons. I think that's a claim to fame of scientists today. If you get featured on The Simpsons, you've made it, Anyway, Stephen Jay Gould admits to the rarity of transitional forms. He says the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. Stephen Jay Gould and others argued, because of the absence of transitionals, have argued for a new method of evolution, or a different method of evolution they call punctuated equilibrium. They argue that organisms can stay the same for a long period of time and then rapidly jump in a punctuated manner and then have a long period of equilibrium. But that's just saltation by another name. Saltation is what was held to in Darwin's day. He proposed a slow and gradual mechanism that he called natural selection. It predicted the fossils would eventually be found. Paleontologists today readily admit on some level that these gaps are real, and now they're starting to argue again for a rapid evolutionary mechanism, one that would not leave fossil forms. But to us, this makes perfect sense. These gaps make perfect sense because the Bible clearly describes God having created many kinds of animals. Many kinds of plants and animals were created in the beginning. Many kinds of animals were then put on board the ark during the flood of Noah and reintroduced afterwards. The creation biologists believe that the kind is this kind designation is synonymous with the family level of classification, at least in mammals. We have this taxonomic hierarchy: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, right? And at the family level, for example, the Canidae, which includes all the canines, would be a biblical kind. So we don't know how many canines God created in the beginning, but we know that there was one pair of canines on board the ark. 2 canines on board the ark, if we're correct. Because they're an unclean animal. There were 7 pairs of clean animals, 1 pair of unclean animal. So from the canines, we get all of these various types of dogs that we have today, providing us with a pretty good illustration. Or the domestic breeding histories from the wolf have shown us all of these various forms were available to the wolf and has been selected out through selective breeding, giving us a pretty good measure of the amount of variability that was present at the creation, or is present to these various kinds of plants and animals. It all makes good sense if we look at it. Darwin also didn't know about heredity, or how traits are inherited from ancestors, from our parents. The principles of heredity were established by this guy right here, Gregor Mendel, who was an Augustinian monk and is today considered the father of genetics. He conducted plant breeding experiments while living in an Austrian monastery. In 1866, his work was published, but went largely unrecognized until the turn of the century, till after the 1900s. Gregor Mendel, just to give you a short summary of what he did breeding experiments with pea plants that had opposing traits. He bought a bunch of different purebred pea plants that were big and pea plants that were small, and then he bred those together. A pea plant that had purple flowers and a pea plant that had white flowers, like in this illustration. And then he bred them together. And then he measured or tracked the passing on of those traits to the offspring in successive generations. So purple flower and white flower, bred those together and checked to see what the offspring looked like in the first generation, then hybridized those and checked to see what it looked like in the next generation, and he established some of the principles of genetics. For example, that some traits are dominant over others. When two traits are blended like this or mated together, only one of them showed up in the first generation. When he self-pollinated that generation, what he found was a specific numerical ratio of the traits in the next. That was always a 3-to-1 ratio of the dominant trait to the recessive trait. In every trait he checked. Every trait he checked, he saw a 3-to-1 ratio. He even did these experiments with multiple traits. So two traits at the same time. A tall plant with purple flowers and a short plant with white flowers, bred those together and checked to see how those traits would be found in the population. But again, found specific numerical ratios. A 9:3 to 3-to-1 ratio was always found when he was checking two traits like this, which showed that evolution is limited. That although there's a lot of variability found in a population, the variability is limited to the genes that are present at the time. The genes can combine, forming lots of variety, lots get shuffled around, forming lots of different kinds of varieties, but it's limited. It's very limited. Fixed ratios are always seen. But I want to insert here another point, and that is that Gregor Mendel, like the great majority of our founding fathers, believed in God. That God created the cosmos, and such scientists were very committed to the existence of God, and for most part, Christianity. The majority, the founding fathers of our various science disciplines believed in God. Nikolai Copernicus, Johannes Kepler, Robert Boyle, Sir Isaac Newton, you can go on and on and on. The vast majority of the founding fathers of our various science disciplines believed in God. The scientific revolution was due to the fact that so many great men of science were active at that period of time who believed in God. Because they had a right worldview, because they had a right, correct view of the world, their theories, their hypotheses and theories were more likely to be correct. Because they believed there was a lawgiver, they looked for fixed order and purpose in what had been made, and they found it. They believed, people like Sir Isaac Newton, so arguably one of the most intelligent men who's ever lived, he believed there was going to be a fixed order in the universe because it had been created rather than being a random chaos, which you would expect from a great cosmic explosion. He looked for it, he found it, he assumed you could describe the physical processes of the universe mathematically. He sought to do so and was able to. When your worldview is correct, your theories will be correct. If you have an incorrect worldview, you will find science operating at a snail's pace, which is what's happening today, especially in the area of cell biology genetics. Darwin also didn't know about genetic information. Now, genetic information exists in the cells of all organisms in this complex molecule called DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, shown here. The actual structure, called a helical structure, double helix, was discovered by James Watson and Francis Crick, who won the Nobel Prize for this in 1962. Now, DNA contains coded, complex instructions that tell cells how to make proteins. It is information. No one denies that is information. Even Bill Gates says by far the most sophisticated program around. It's information. And as such, it stands as the single most powerful argument for intelligent design that exists. Because in all human experience, information comes from only one source, and that's an intelligent mind. When we discovered that information existed within cells, within every organism on Earth, it should have led to the conclusion that that information was also likely the result of an intelligent mind. Because that's how science is supposed to work. You're supposed to use your past experience, your knowledge that you have to inform your conclusions. Your hypothesis is supposed to be based on prior knowledge. Based on all human experience, information comes from only one source, an intelligent mind. It should have led inexorably, with certainty, to the hypothesis that the information found in cells that governs the biological world was a result of intelligent mind as well. because again, that's how science is supposed to work. But with regard to the theory of evolution, they've taken the scientific method and flipped it on its head. You're supposed to start with a hypothesis and then do some experiments, and you could elevate that to a theory if your experiments show it to be true, and then you try to falsify your theory. You do experiments trying to falsify your theory, and if you can't falsify it under any conceivable circumstance, you may be able to consider it a fact. But they've taken the scientific method, flipped it on its head. They are assuming evolution's a fact, and now they're trying to work out the theories to support it. Whether it's through our Darwinian mechanisms or some other, they're still debating these points, but it's a fact that it's occurred. They teach it as a fact, and they teach it evangelically. Now, the amount of DNA information packed into a cell is just mind-boggling. To illustrate this, let me explain to you what you're looking at. On the DNA molecule, it looks like a ladder that's been twisted. And every step of the ladder is made up of a different molecule. We represent those molecules by the letters A, T, C, and G. Adenosine triphosphate, thymidine triphosphate, cytosine triphosphate, guanidine triphosphate, abbreviated with the letters A, T, C, and G. This is a sequencing gel. One of the ways that they determine the sequence of molecules along the length of this ladder is by running them out on a gel, and that's what that is. I did many sequencing gels while a technician at Texas Tech. And then you generate your data that looks like this. It's a sequence of A, T, C's, and G's. It's a code, though, that the cell translates, and it's an instruction that tells them how to make proteins. And proteins are the machinery and material that make life possible. It tells them not only how to make the proteins, but what to do with them afterwards, where to take them, what else to assemble them to. It's a very complex genetic code. But to illustrate how much information is there, if every letter here, which again represents a different rung of this ladder, if every letter there is equal to a letter in our alphabet, then in one human cell, there's about as much information as there are in 1,000 books. Or a little 2-millimeter pinhead-sized pile of DNA contains as many letters as there would be in 500 stacks of books reaching the moon, or a single stack of books reaching the sun. It's an incredible amount of information. An incredible compression system for information is being used there. But again, where do Darwinists say all this information came from? Random mutations. That the first organism had a little bit of DNA, managed to somehow pop a little bit of DNA into existence at the beginning, and from that little bit of information, more information has developed through time by randomly changing that information. That as the DNA strand was copied, a few mistakes were made every time it was copied, or exposures to foreign mutagens like UV bombardments eventually increased the amount of information. It's an affront to reason. It's an affront to logic, and it's an affront to common sense to suggest such a thing, because you just cannot create more information by randomly changing information. You cannot go into a book and randomly change letters and produce your second volume of your book, no matter how hard you might try. But this is the theory they rely on, and it's more collectively referred to as neo-Darwinism or new Darwinism. But one of the things we know, although there are times when a mutation can produce a beneficial outcome, that's always due to the destruction of information. If a cell loses a protein that it was making, that can be beneficial under some isolated circumstances. Antibiotic resistances are frequently due to something like that. An antibiotic is working against a bacteria by attacking some particular protein that it has, and if it dumps that protein, then the antibiotic is no longer effective. So it can produce a benefit. But the vast majority of mutations we are aware of produce disorders and diseases. A great list of genetic diseases is at this point on file. But to be perfectly honest, on rare circumstances, and I've had a chance to look over the results of mutagenesis studies as a technician, under rare circumstances, a mutation can do something remarkable. I mean, it can give you the ability to produce laser beams out your eyes, or so it can survive, damage so well that they can coat your skeleton with adamantium. If you don't know what this picture is, then yeah, terrible. This is the X-Men. So X-Men, due to mutations, or superheroes due to mutation. But no. Mutations don't do these kind of things. That's why we call it science fiction. It's science fiction. Darwin also didn't know about molecular machines, that within cells are microscopic nanoscale machines. Darwin said if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed that could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down, but I can find out no such case. Well, Charles, Numerous molecular machines have now been discovered which are, in fact, irreducibly complex. They simply cannot be developed through numerous successive slight modifications. This is called a kinesin. It's a little walking robot that transports packages from one side of the cell to another. Lots and lots of molecular machines have been found at this point in time that can't be developed through numerous successive slight modifications by adding one piece, and then after a few generations adding one more piece, and then after a few generations adding one more piece. The machine doesn't work unless all the pieces are there at the exact same time. One of these remarkable machines is possessed by a bacteria. These are bacteria that are swimming around using a little outboard motor that they have called, this one's stuck on the slide. You want to kind of help them, give them a little budge, trying to get them loose out this slide. But these are swimming through a motor that they have that's called a flagellum. Shown here. The flagellum is a nano machine that is built using information in approximately 50 different genes, 50 different genetic segments we call genes. And it contains about 25 to 40 different proteins depending on the species. Each of these proteins exist in multiple copies. This shows how the flagellum is actually built within the bacterial cell, the sequence of steps that goes through to actually build this machine. It's a complex molecular nanoscale type machine that exists within bacteria. It has proteins that make up the filament that you see here through a long, narrow central channel to the end where they self-assemble. The bacteria constructs this complex nanoscale structure through more efficiently than any human design process could. It is, in short, the world's smallest rotary propulsion system. It has all the parts that we would place in our own motors. It is constructed of proteins, as I mentioned, each with a different function. Some serve as a rotary motor, others serve as bushings, there's a drive shaft, there's a rotation switch regulator, there's a universal joint, and then the long helical propeller that is used to drive the bacteria forward. Francis Crick, do you remember who I said Francis Crick was? He was one of the co-discoverers of the DNA helix. He won the Nobel Prize in 1962. He admits to seeing evidence of design, but states that biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. There's tremendous evidence of design out there. Romans 1:20 says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature are clearly seen in what has been made, so that men are without excuse." They have to keep reminding themselves that there is not design, and after all, it looks designed, but it is rather evolved. Darwin didn't know about the problems of life's origin. In a letter written in 1871 to a botanist friend of his, Charles Darwin suggested a natural origin of life in a warm little pond. He said, "It is often said that all the conditions for the first production of a living organism are present, which could ever have been present. But if, and oh, what a big if, we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc., present, that a protein compound would chemically form, ready to undergo still more complex changes. At the present day, much such matter would be instantly devoured or absorbed, which would not have been the case before living creatures were formed." However, to understand the origin of life challenges facing evolution, it's important to point out a number of things, and that is that multiple macromolecules are necessary to have a living cell. I'll show you some probability numbers here in just a second. But we should understand this, that people of old assumed that life could arise spontaneously, could just arise spontaneously. And that's because if the food eventually just seems to grow organisms, you know? If you don't, even in refrigeration, eventually you can see some mold or some fungus just suddenly pop into existence, right? And in fact, in 1668, Francisco Redi did an experiment to show that flies would not just spontaneously form on meat if he covered that meat with the gauze. But even after Francisco Redi's experiment, scientists, even Francisco Redi, continued to believe in spontaneous generation under some conditions. The advent of the microscope even further enhanced the belief, because under microscopic analysis of water samples, for example, a clean water sample would suddenly birth a number of swimming organisms. You can take a handful of grass, stick it in water, leave it in a warm place for a little bit and come back, and it's teeming with all kinds of little swimming creatures. Well, spontaneous generation, or so they thought. But this was finally laid to rest by Louis Pasteur. He was a devout Catholic and a creationist who was known as the father of microbiology. His discovery that most infectious organisms are caused by germs, known as the germ theory of disease, is one of the most important in medical history. He also discovered several species of bacteria. He discovered Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, and pneumonia, which are responsible for staph infections, strep throat, and pneumonia. In 1859, the same year that Darwin published The Origin of Species, the French Academy of Sciences sponsored a contest for the best experiment that could prove or disprove the origin of life. In Pasteur's winning experiment, what he did was he constructed a gooseneck flask. This is Pasteur's gooseneck flask that was used to win this contest. He boiled some meat broth inside until it was sterile, and then after that, no organisms grew, even though it was exposed to the atmosphere. But what he did then was he tipped the gooseneck flask so that the meat broth could get into the neck and then come back into the flask, and after doing that, it became contaminated with bacteria and fungi. And so he argued that living organisms are everywhere, even in the air. What this did was to show that these acts of spontaneous generation are because of particles of organisms that are in the air, and if they fall into the meat broth, they will grow, and if they can't, they won't. Simply put. But although spontaneous generation had been conclusively refuted almost 20 years prior by Louis Pasteur, Haeckel continued to advocate for its belief on purely religious grounds. In 1876, he said, if we do not accept the hypothesis of spontaneous generation, then at this one point in the history of evolution, we must have recourse to the miracle of supernatural creation. Haeckel chose spontaneous generation, even though there was no empirical evidence to support it, because he did not like the alternative, that is, a belief in God. 24 years after Pasteur's award-winning experiment, Ernst Haeckel committed another act of fraud to prove that life arose spontaneously on Earth. He claimed the existence of first cells that he named monerons and described them as being very primitive protocells that are not composed of any organs at all, but consist entirely of shapeless, simple, homogeneous matter. They're nothing more than a shapeless, mobile little lump of mucus or slime, consisting of albuminous combinations of carbon. But where did Haeckel see this cell he described as a simple little lump of mucus or slime? They were only found in his imagination. They are, in fact, a theoretical necessity for the theory of evolution that life originated all on its own. However, the lack of their existence did not stop him from making more than 30 drawings of these imaginary monerons, which, along with 73 pages of speculations, were published in a prestigious scientific journal in 1868. He also gave them scientific names, such as Protoamoeba primitiva, because a primitive protoamoeba must have existed before the first amoeba. But the extent of his drawings of monerons shown here is really one of the measures of his fraud. The height of his deception is better illustrated by the fact that he made similarly detailed but accurate drawings of diatoms shown here. Diatoms are single-cell algae that enclose themselves in a wall made of silica, which have these beautiful symmetric forms. And Ernst Haeckel published on diatoms. These are two plates from his book titled Art Forms in Nature. Ernst Haeckel had access to the most advanced optical technology available to his time as a professor at Jena University, and published pictures here on diatoms. Having some of the best optical technology available just shows that he knew better. It wasn't that he knew better. He was able to see diatoms. But his book titled Art Form in Nature is interesting too. Isn't it interesting that he could see art in nature, but not an artisan behind that nature? The monerons that Haeckel imagined did not then, nor do they now exist. The actual organisms, bacteria, that were later given this name, monerons, are now known to be in possession of one of those most complex molecular machines we're aware of, the bacterial flagellum. Let me just show you. I gotta move towards a close pretty quick. To add further weight to the problem of the origin of life, let me show you the probability of just a single small protein forming through purely natural processes. This is the calculated probability for a single chain of amino acids forming that's only 150 in length. Okay? 150 amino acids. This is the probability. 1 out of 10 to the 164th power. This is a trillion times smaller than the odds of finding a single specific particle amongst all the particles in the known universe. And this is a tiny little protein, 150 in length. The RNA polymerase, which is responsible for copying DNA and so that that code can later become a protein, has 3,000 amino acids. But that was the probability of just getting one little protein to form. However, to get a cell requires multiple macromolecules. You have to have DNA, you have to have proteins, you have to have carbohydrates, you have to have lipids. Multiple big macromolecules are required to have that first cell. And although Darwin and his contemporaries could envision of a cell that was a little lump or mucus or slime, we now know that the cell is an object of unparalleled complexity and adaptive design. The more we learn about the cell, the more we're just blown away with how complex it really is. And we still, at this point, only really know the big picture. Because they're so microscopic, we can't really see them in action. We can show animations of what's going on like this, but it's really like we're looking at them from a distant hilltop with a telescope, trying to figure out what's going on. That's kind of what we're doing. But again, there's little you can draw as far as analogy is concerned to compare with the cell. It's unparalleled in its complexity. A marvel of modern technology like a Boeing 747 doesn't compare. They have orders of magnitude more moving parts. A factory that builds 747s doesn't compare. The cell is literally like a city in complexity. It has not only machines, it has factories, it has highway systems, it has trucks and trains hauling things from one side to another.